Charlotte Bennett pressed her hand flat against the wound in her side and did not make a single sound. Across the candlelit ballroom, her husband laughed. He did not look her way. He had not looked her way in 7 months. She had stopped the blade meant for him. She had taken the cut that should have killed him. And she was standing here now, bleeding slowly into the lining of her dress, while the man who married her out of hatred danced with another woman and called it a fine evening. If this story moves you, subscribe and follow along until the very end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The wedding took place on a Thursday morning in June 1815, and there was no joy in it. Not in the way Charlotte had once imagined a wedding might feel as a girl pressing flowers between the pages of her mother's Bible, dreaming of a man who would take her hand and mean it. Not in the careful way she had arranged her hair that morning, or in the ivory dress her mother had wept over and called beautiful. None of that softness survived the moment she walked into the front parlor of Hawthorne Manor and saw Nathaniel Hawthorne standing at the far end of the room, looking at her the way a judge looks at a verdict he's already written. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way men who worked land and carried rifles grew to be. His jaw was set hard, his dark eyes flat and measuring. He wore a black coat and a pressed white cravat, and he looked every inch the powerful landowner that half of Massachusetts County either respected or feared. He did not smile when she entered. He did not step forward to meet her. He simply watched her walk toward him and said when she reached his side, "Miss Bennett." Not Charlotte. Not even a nod of his head. Just her surname delivered like the closing of a door. "Mr. Hawthorne," she answered. Her voice was steady. She had practiced that. The minister was already waiting. The ceremony lasted 14 minutes. Charlotte knew because she counted every one of them. Reverend Aldous spoke of union of covenant, of two becoming one before God and the gathered witnesses. Charlotte kept her eyes on the window behind him, where the summer fields stretched gold and green all the way to the tree line. She had always loved Massachusetts in June. She thought she might have to stop loving it now since it belonged to him, and everything that belonged to him seemed to be something he intended to punish. When Nathaniel slid the ring onto her finger, his hand was dry and his grip was brief. He let go the moment the metal settled into place, as if even that small contact was more than he was willing to offer. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Aldous said. Nathaniel looked at her for a long, unbearable moment. Then he turned to the minister and said quietly, "That won't be necessary." Charlotte did not flinch. She had known going in what kind of marriage this would be. Her father had told her with his last breaths, his hand trembling in hers, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone wants these two families to destroy each other, Charlotte. Someone has already won if you let hatred be the end of this. Go, marry him, and find out who that someone is." She had promised, and she kept her promises. The story of why Nathaniel Hawthorne married a woman he despised was not complicated in its bones, though it had been complicated by years and grief and the particular kind of rage that grows in men who believe they have been wronged beyond forgiveness. 12 years before that June wedding, the Hawthorne family had been one of the most prosperous landowning families in Massachusetts County. Edmund Hawthorne. Nathaniel's father had been a gentleman farmer of the old tradition, known for his fairness, his generosity with struggling tenant families, and his unshakable belief that a man's word was the foundation of everything he built. Then came the shipping contracts. Edmund Hawthorne had entered a joint venture with Richard Bennett, Charlotte's father, a Boston merchant with a reputation for solid dealing and long memory. The venture was intended to move goods along the eastern coastal trade routes, a profitable arrangement by all reasonable estimation. Within 2 years, everything had collapsed. Money went missing. Contracts were broken. Richard Bennett's name appeared on documents Edmund swore he had never signed, authorizing transfers that drained the Hawthorne accounts to nothing. Edmund Hawthorne died in the winter of 1808, broken by debt and convinced he had been deceived by a man he trusted. He left behind 2 sons, a mortgaged estate, and a warning to Nathaniel that rang like a death bell. Don't let him escape consequence. Whatever it costs you, don't let him walk free. Nathaniel had spent 7 years rebuilding Hawthorne Manor through sheer force of will, working the land harder than any of his tenant farmers, refusing offers of help from neighbors who pitied him, driving every cent back into the estate until it stood again on solid ground. He had done it with his father's warning carved into the center of his chest, and he had done it with the name Richard Bennett rotting there alongside it. When Richard Bennett's health failed in the spring of 1815, and it became known that the man's business was collapsing under debts of its own, Nathaniel had seen his opportunity. He had gone to Boston and presented an offer so blunt it had silenced the room. He would absorb the Bennett family's remaining debts. He would take possession of certain business accounts, and he would marry Charlotte Bennett, the merchant's only daughter. In exchange, Richard Bennett would sign documents confirming the details of the original venture, which in Nathaniel's hands would be used to formally destroy whatever remained of the Bennett name in Boston business circles. Richard Bennett had signed, but not Charlotte had learned for the reasons Nathaniel assumed. She discovered her father's true reasoning in the letters he left behind, hidden in the false bottom of his writing desk, which she had carried to Hawthorne Manor in the one trunk Nathaniel had not bothered to inspect. My darling Charlotte. The first letter began. I am not guilty of what Nathaniel Hawthorne believes. I swear this to you on your mother's grave and on every prayer I have ever spoken. But I cannot prove it yet. The man who destroyed both our families has covered his tracks with the patience of a spider, and I have not had time enough to find every thread. I am sending you into that house because I believe the evidence still exists. Edmund Hawthorne was a careful man. He kept records of everything. If his papers still survive, if his old correspondence was preserved, then somewhere inside Hawthorne Manor is the proof that will clear our name and name the man who truly did this to us. I know what I am asking of you. I know what it will cost. But you are the strongest person I have ever known, and I am trusting you with the only thing that matters now. Charlotte had read the letter 3 times, then folded it and placed it beneath the floorboard in her room at Hawthorne Manor, where she kept it still. She had not told Nathaniel, not yet. She needed evidence first. Accusations without proof would only make him angrier, and anger was the only language he currently spoke. Betty. The harvest celebration at Hawthorne Manor came 6 weeks after the wedding, and it was the first time Charlotte understood exactly what she was dealing with. The manor's great hall was full of summer lantern light, and the kind of people who attended powerful men's celebrations because they needed to be seen doing so. County officials, neighboring landowners, merchants from the nearest towns. Women in fine cotton dresses, and men in their best coats moving through the room with the particular ease of people who had never questioned whether they belonged there. Charlotte wore pale blue. Her hair was pinned properly, her posture correct. Her expression, the carefully composed one she had spent years building in Boston, drawing rooms where kindness was always being tested. She had been standing near the long table for approximately 20 minutes when she realized that no one was going to speak to her unless she forced the occasion. The women nearby shifted when she approached. The men addressed Nathaniel and looked through her as if she were a gap in the air. She understood. She was the merchant's daughter. She was the outsider. She was the wife Nathaniel Hawthorne had married under circumstances that had apparently been discussed in detail by every family in the county before she arrived. She was composing something polite to say to the woman nearest her, the wife of a county clerk, whose name she had carefully memorized when Nathaniel crossed the room to her side. For one brief and humiliating second, something hopeful moved through her. He was coming to stand beside her. He was going to do the thing a husband did at his own gathering, the thing that cost nothing, but would mean everything. Then he walked past her. He walked directly past her, close enough that she could have touched his sleeve, and offered his arm to Mrs. Eleanor Marsh, the widow of a neighboring estate owner. A polished woman of 40, with sharp eyes and a sharper smile. Mrs. Marsh, Nathaniel said, and his voice had warmth in it. Actual warmth. The kind Charlotte had never once heard directed at herself. Allow me. Mrs. Marsh took his arm with a look of satisfied victory that she made no effort to conceal. Charlotte stood where she was. Around her she heard it, the soft, careful sound of people noticing and saying nothing, which was always louder than anything they could have said aloud. A lady nearby pressed her fan to her mouth. Two men exchanged a glance. Someone across the room laughed, and she could not be certain it was not at her. She turned toward the window. Outside, the summer fields were dark now, the tree line a black edge against the last pale blue of the sky. She kept her face toward the glass and breathed evenly, and she did not let a single thing she was feeling reach her expression. She had been here 6 weeks. She would find the evidence. She would clear her father's name. And then she would decide what to do about the rest of it. Martha, the estate's head housekeeper, found her still at the window an hour later. Martha Briggs was 60 years old, short and wide through the middle, with gray hair coiled tight at her neck, and the eyes of a woman who had seen everything this house contained and chosen to remain anyway. She had served Edmund Hawthorne for 30 years. She served his son out of loyalty, and because she believed in some deep and stubborn part of herself that the boy's bitterness would eventually burn itself out. "You ought to eat something, ma'am," Martha said, appearing at Charlotte's elbow with a plate that she pressed firmly into Charlotte's hands. "Standing by windows doesn't do much for a person's constitution." "Thank you, Martha." Charlotte looked at the plate. Small sandwiches, a slice of cold ham, 2 biscuits. "You didn't have to." "Didn't have to," Martha agreed. "Did it anyway." She positioned herself alongside Charlotte, facing the window as well, her tone shifting from proper to something more private. "Don't let them see it." "I beg your pardon." "Whatever you're feeling right now." Martha did not look at her. "Don't let a single one of them see it. That's my advice, and I'm giving it free of charge." Charlotte considered the plate in her hands. "He walked past me, Martha, in front of everyone." "I know. He didn't even pause." "I know that too." Martha was quiet for a moment. "He's been angry for a very long time, Mrs. Hawthorne. Long enough that it's become the only thing he knows how to be. That's not an excuse. I want to be clear, I'm not offering it as one." "Then what are you offering it as?" Martha finally turned and looked at her directly. Her expression was not pitying. It was something closer to assessment, the look of a woman determining whether someone was strong enough to be told the truth. "An explanation," she said. "So you know what you're working with." Charlotte took a small bite of a biscuit. "I know what I'm working with," she said after a moment. "I've known since before I arrived." Martha studied her for another long second, then made a small sound that might have been approval. "Supper's at 8, she said. "He likely won't be there, hasn't eaten at the family table in years. But I'll see that something good is sent up to your room." She moved away through the crowd. Plateless, her hands clasped behind her back, her posture absolute. Charlotte turned back to the window. "I know what I'm working with," she had said. And she did. She knew the bitterness. She knew the calculation. She knew the contempt. What she had not entirely prepared for, what still surprised her, if she was honest, was how it felt to be walked past. To be invisible in a room full of people in the house where she was supposed to be the mistress. She set her jaw and finished the biscuit. She would start with the study. Edmund Hawthorne's old records had to be somewhere in this house, and she intended to find them before summer ended. She would find the evidence. She would find the name. And when she did, Nathaniel Hawthorne would have to decide what kind of man he actually wanted to be. 3 days after the harvest celebration, Charlotte was in the East Wing corridor at 10:30 in the morning when she heard raised voices from the direction of the main study. One voice was Nathaniel's. The other, lower and smoother, belonged to a man she had seen only twice since her arrival. Jonathan Pierce, the family's longtime legal advisor. She did not slow her steps. She turned, walked quietly to the study door, which stood 3 inches open, and listened. "The accounts are entirely in order," Pierce was saying. "I reviewed them myself last quarter. There's nothing there that requires the mistress's attention." "I didn't say she was reviewing accounts," Nathaniel said. His voice was tight. "I said she was in the records room yesterday for 2 hours. I want to know what she was looking for." Women from merchant families sometimes develop curiosity about household management. It's rarely significant. "She's not curious about household management." A pause. "She's organized, Pierce. She's more organized than she has any reason to be." She asked Briggs last week about the shipping ledgers from the 1803 venture. Briggs told her they were archived and said nothing further, but the question was asked. Silence. I'll speak to her, Pierce said finally. Gently, of course. Simply redirect her attention toward more appropriate pursuits. I don't need you to manage my wife, Nathaniel said. There was something cold in his voice that hadn't been there before. Not anger exactly, but a sharpened attention. I need you to tell me whether she has any reason to find something in those ledgers. Another silence. Longer. No, Pierce said. There's nothing to find. Charlotte pressed her back flat against the wall and breathed carefully through her nose. He was lying. She had known looking at the man that he was lying, the particular ease of a person who had been lying for so long that it had become his natural posture. What she had not known until this moment was that Nathaniel was beginning to notice things. Not the right things yet. Not the things she needed him to notice. But he was watching, and he was asking questions, and that meant she needed to move faster than she had planned. She straightened, arranged her expression, and walked in the opposite direction toward the kitchen. She had letters to find, and she was running out of time. That evening, Nathaniel was in the stable yard past sundown when Charlotte came to find him. She had not come to find him before. In 6 weeks of marriage, she had waited for him to come to her not out of pride, but because she had understood instinctively that going toward him uninvited would be taken as aggression. He was a man who needed to feel in control of his own spaces, and she had been careful to give him that. Tonight, she was less careful. He was working on a fence post, driving it in with a mallet, his coat discarded over the rail, his shirt dark with sweat at the shoulders. He did not look up when she approached. Mr. Hawthorne? It's late, he said without stopping. I know. Go back inside. I'd like to speak with you first. He stopped, set the mallet down, turned and looked at her with the particular quality of attention he gave things he found irritating, fully present, fully cold. Speak then, he said. Charlotte clasped her hands in front of her, not in supplication and control. I found something today in your father's old correspondence files. Everything about him went still. What? He said, flat, not a question, a letter, from a shipping broker in Philadelphia dated October 1805. Written to your father describing a discrepancy in the transfer authorizations for the joint venture with my father's company. She held his gaze. The discrepancy involves a signature that appears on documents authorizing the final account transfers. Your father had written across the top of the letter in his own hand, "This signature is not Richard Bennett's. I am certain of it." The silence that followed was so complete, she could hear the horses shifting in their stalls. You're lying, Nathaniel said. His voice was very quiet. I'm not. You're protecting your family. My father is dead, she said, and something sharp moved through her voice before she could stop it. He died in April, Mr. Hawthorne, 3 weeks before our wedding. There is nothing left of my family to protect. What there is left is the truth, and I would very much like to know it. I believe you would too, if you let yourself. He stared at her. In the low light of the stable yard, his face was unreadable. The hard jaw, the flat dark eyes, the set of a man who had organized his entire life around a certainty, and was now being asked to consider that the certainty had been constructed by someone else's hand. Where is the letter? He said finally. Safe, she said. Until I've found more. More? This is not the only piece, Mr. Hawthorne. I believe there are others. I believe whoever arranged this was careful and thorough, and left a trail only because they were confident no one would ever look. She kept her voice even. I am looking. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he picked up his coat from the rail, turned his back on her, and walked toward the manor house without another word. Charlotte stood in the stable yard alone, listening to the summer insects and the sound of her own breathing. He had not thrown her out. He had not told her to stop. He had not believed her either. She could see that plainly. But something had moved in his face in the moment between silence and departure, something small and unsteady that looked very faintly like the beginning of doubt. It was not enough. Not yet. But it was a start. The morning after Charlotte showed Nathaniel the letter, she came downstairs to find that someone had moved her writing desk. It had been in the corner of the small sitting room she used as a private space, the room Martha had quietly assigned to her on the first day, without being asked, with the particular efficiency of a woman who understood that a new wife in a hostile house needed at least one door she could close. The desk had been there for 6 weeks. Her papers arranged in a precise order that she could read at a glance. Her father's letters tucked beneath the hidden bottom board. Her notes folded small and pressed between the pages of the household ledger she kept as cover. The desk was now in the hallway. Not moved carelessly, not knocked by accident. Moved deliberately. Legs set square against the baseboard, as if someone had decided the sitting room required more space for purposes she had not been informed of. Charlotte stood in the doorway and looked at her desk in the hallway and understood exactly what was being communicated. She called for no one. She walked to the desk, picked up the stack of papers on top, checked the hidden board the letters were still there, undisturbed, and carried everything back inside. Then she pulled a chair in front of the sitting room door, sat down with her household ledger open across her knees, and began working through the morning's accounts as if nothing had happened at all. Martha appeared 20 minutes later with tea and set it down without comment. But the look she gave the chair wedged under the door handle held a quantity of quiet respect that Charlotte found steadying. The Eastfield tenants were asking about the harvest allocation, Martha said. 3 families, the Coopers, the Miles, and old Tom Greer. They didn't want to bother Mr. Hawthorne directly. They shouldn't have to, Charlotte said. What do they need? Extra storage space. The yields came in higher than expected, which sounds like good fortune, until you realize nobody has anywhere to put the surplus, and it'll rot before market day. Charlotte wrote something in the margin of her ledger. Is the old Cooperage building still standing on the north edge of the property? Martha's eyebrows rose slightly. It is. Nobody's used it in 4 or 5 years. Has it been inspected recently? Not that I know of. I'd like to walk it this afternoon, Charlotte said. Will you send word to Tom Greer that I'll come by his place first and he can show me what they're working with? Martha looked at her for a moment with the expression Charlotte was coming to recognize as the woman's version of approval, not warm exactly, but solid. I'll send word, she said. Charlotte was already writing again when Martha left. She was also beneath the ledger reading her father's letters for the 4th time, looking for the name she had not yet found. Tom Greer was 71 years old and had worked Hawthorne land since before Nathaniel was born. He had the hands of a man who had spent half a century in earth and weather, and the eyes of someone who had watched a great deal and said little, which Charlotte recognized as its own kind of intelligence. He met her at the edge of his property, with his hat in both hands and the careful posture of a man unsure whether he was about to be helped or managed. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said. Didn't expect. You shouldn't have had to wait, she said. Tell me exactly what you're working with. He did. He was thorough and specific the way farmers who've learned from hard experience always are, and Charlotte listened without interrupting, asking 2 or 3 questions that made him pause and look at her sideways the way people did when they encountered competence they hadn't anticipated. The Cooperage building was sound in its bones, she confirmed for herself, by pressing her hands against the frame posts and listening to the solidity of what she found. 2 windows needed new glass, a section of roof wanted patching, and the floor had warped in one corner from old water damage that had since dried. None of it was catastrophic. All of it was fixable within a week with the right hands. I'll speak to the estate carpenter today, she told Tom. The building should be ready before the week's end. In the meantime, I'll have 2 extra wagons sent from the main stores to help with the interim transport. Tom Greer turned his hat twice through his hands. We didn't want to be a bother, he said. You're not a bother, Charlotte said. You're Hawthorne tenants, which means the estate has a responsibility to you. I take that seriously. She met his eyes directly. I intend to take it seriously from here forward. If something needs attending and you don't feel comfortable bringing it to Mr. Hawthorne's attention, you come to me. Directly. All right. He looked at her for a long moment, Then he put his hat back on his head, which was she was learning the way a man of his generation indicated that he'd made up his mind about something. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She was back at the manor by 3 o'clock. By 4, she had spoken to the carpenter, issued the wagon order, and written 2 letters to supply contacts in Boston, whose names she'd carried in her memory from her father's business days. She was sealing the second letter when the study door opened and Nathaniel walked in. He stopped when he saw her at the desk. "This is my study," he said. "I know." She kept sealing the letter, pressing the wax flat with his own seal, which she had borrowed from the inkstand because she had not yet been given one of her own. "I needed the business directory. I'll be out of your way in a moment." He stood where he was watching her. She could feel it, the particular weight of his attention when she was doing something he hadn't anticipated. "The Cooperage building," he said. "Briggs told me you ordered repairs." "I ordered repairs," she confirmed, without asking me. "The tenants needed immediate attention." She looked up. "The surplus from the Eastfield harvest will begin degrading within the week if there's nowhere to store it properly. That's a financial loss, as well as a hardship to 3 families who depend on this land." She held his gaze steadily. "I acted on what the situation required. If you'd prefer to be consulted for decisions of this scale in the future, I'll make sure to seek you out first." Something moved across his face, not quite anger, not quite something else. She was beginning to understand a man who had not anticipated having to navigate this particular kind of competence. Women, in his experience, had either deferred or schemed. Charlotte was doing neither, and it was throwing off a calculation he had already made. "The business directory," he said finally. "I've found what I needed." She closed it and set it back precisely where she'd taken it from. Then she picked up her letters, stood and walked toward the door. She was nearly past him when he said, "Why are you writing to Boston suppliers?" She stopped, turned back halfway. "Because the estate's current contract with the Harwich Dry Goods Warehouse ends in October," she said. "And the terms of the renewal quote I found in your files are 12% above current market rate. I have 2 contacts in Boston who can likely better it." She paused. "Unless you have an existing arrangement with the Harwich warehouse that I'm not aware of." He said nothing. "I'll let you know what they come back with," Charlotte said, and left. She was at the end of the corridor before she allowed herself to breathe. She found the first real piece of evidence on a Tuesday morning in July, and it arrived the way most important things arrived, sideways and unexpected, hidden inside something ordinary. She had been working through a box of Edmund Hawthorne's miscellaneous business correspondence, which she had located in the attic under 3 other boxes of household invoices from the 1790s. Martha had shown her to the attic on the pretext of looking for old curtain fabric. Charlotte had spent 40 minutes locating the right box while maintaining an entirely convincing expression of mild domestic interest. The letter she found was not addressed to Edmund. It was addressed to a shipping broker in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and it had been placed apparently by accident inside Edmund Hawthorne's files, perhaps because the broker had sent multiple pieces of correspondence in the same packet, and one had been misfiled. But it was not an accident that mattered to Charlotte. What mattered was the content. The letter was from Jonathan Pierce. It was dated September 1803, 2 months before the joint venture between the Hawthorne and Bennett families collapsed, and it contained a series of instructions, formal in language, specific in detail, regarding the transfer of funds from a holding account that had no official name in any document Charlotte had yet located to a destination identified only by a set of account numbers. What made her hands go very still was the postscript written in Pierce's own careful script at the bottom of the page. "The forged instrument is ready. R.B.'s signature has been replicated with sufficient accuracy to satisfy any cursory examination. I would not recommend a detailed forensic review, but the parties involved are not likely to request one. Once the transfer clears, both families will have more pressing concerns than examining signatures." Charlotte sat on the attic floor for a long time without moving. R.B. Richard Bennett. Her father. Pierce had forged her father's signature. Pierce had arranged the transfers. Pierce had engineered the entire collapse 20 years ago, and then spent the years since managing Nathaniel Hawthorne's affairs and his estate's finances, sitting inside the house he'd helped to wound, waiting for what she could only assume was his endgame. She folded the letter with great care, placed it inside her dress, and went back downstairs. She did not find Nathaniel. She was not ready to find Nathaniel, not with one letter, not when Pierce was still trusted completely, not when going to him now would only result in Pierce being warned before she had the full picture. Instead, she went to the kitchen, helped Martha with the noon preparations, and kept her expression so thoroughly unremarkable that only someone watching very closely would have noticed that her hands were not entirely steady. Jonathan Pierce arrived at the manor that afternoon. He was a tall man, rangy in the way men who'd kept themselves spare through age sometimes were, with silver at his temples and the particular manner of a person accustomed to being the smartest presence in any room. He had always treated Charlotte with a surface politeness that she had recognized from her first meeting as the kind of courtesy that conceals assessment, the practiced grace of a man taking her measure while appearing merely to be sociable. She was serving tea in the front parlor when he arrived, which had not been her intention, but which she decided immediately to use. "Mrs. Hawthorne." He took the chair across from her without being invited, which was its own kind of statement. "What a domestic picture! How are you settling into the manor?" "Very well, thank you," she said pleasantly. She poured his tea without being asked. "Summer has been kind." "It has." He accepted the cup, watching her. "I understand you've been quite industrious. The tenants speak highly of you. I hope to be useful wherever I can." "Of course." He smiled. It was a good smile, practiced and warm, the kind that didn't move his eyes. "I did want to mention, since we have a moment, I noticed you've been spending time in the records rooms. Purely out of household interest, I'm sure, but some of the older files are rather delicate. It might be wise to leave the archival documents to someone with more experience handling them." Charlotte looked at him over the rim of her cup. "I appreciate the thought," she said. "I'll be careful." "I only mention it because—" "I'll be very careful," she said again, with a smile that matched his in every technical particular. A beat of silence passed between them. Something shifted in his expression, something small and cool that he covered almost instantly. "Of course," he said. "I'm sure you will be." He stayed 40 minutes, spoke to Nathaniel in the study for 30 of them, and left with the easy, unhurried manner of a man who believed himself entirely safe. Charlotte watched him ride down the front drive from the sitting room window, and the letter against her ribs felt like a coal. She needed more. She needed the account numbers traced. She needed to know where the money had gone and whether it could be connected to Pierce's own holdings. She needed above all else to keep her own investigation invisible for long enough to complete it, which meant she needed to be very careful about Nathaniel. The problem with Nathaniel was not that he was stupid. The problem was the opposite. He began in the weeks that followed to watch her. Not the cold surveillance he'd maintained in the early weeks of their marriage. This was different, more specific. He noticed when she disappeared for hours with no explanation he could find. He noticed that the estate's accounts had shifted in ways his advisors hadn't managed in 5 years. He noticed that his tenants, who had been cooling toward the manor since his father's death, had begun speaking of Charlotte with a warmth they did not trouble to hide. He did not say any of this to her directly. He said it in the way unavailable men said things sideways through action. He started eating at the family table again. Not every evening, not with any warmth. He sat at the far end, ate in near silence, and left before Charlotte finished her own meal. But he came, and he watched. One night in late July, he arrived at the table to find her teaching Ruth, one of the kitchen girls, 14 years old and sharp as a new pin, to read from a borrowed primer. Ruth had her finger on the page and was sounding out a word with the intense concentration of someone who understood that this moment was important. Nathaniel stood in the doorway for a moment, then came in and sat down and said nothing about it. When Ruth got the word right, "Fortune, if you can keep a thing that starts out fortune, is anything other than cruel," Charlotte said. "There you are!" And the girl beamed with a brightness that filled the room. Nathaniel said very quietly, "My mother used to say learning the name of a thing gives you some power over it." Both Charlotte and Ruth looked at him. He had already directed his attention to his plate, but Charlotte heard it. She tucked it away with the same care she gave everything her evidence, her father's letters, her own feelings, that she was managing with increasing effort. 3 days later, she overheard two of the stable hands talking in the yard. She was not meant to hear, which was the only reason they were honest about it. "She fixed the water line on the Cooper place herself," one of them said. "I saw her, rolled her sleeves up and fixed it. Tom Greer said she refused to let anyone do it for her because the carpenter was already stretched 3 ways. The master know about that." A pause. "Don't think so. But the Coopers know. The Miles family knows. Old Greer's been telling everybody who'll listen." "Huh." Another pause. "She's nothing like what Pierce said she'd be." The silence that followed that sentence was very specific. Charlotte, standing on the other side of the fence post, did not move. "What did Pierce say?" the first voice asked. "Said she was her father's creature. Said the whole marriage was a Bennett scheme to get their hands back into Hawthorne money." And now, a long moment. "Now I think Pierce said what Pierce needed us to hear," the second man said. "And I think he was full of it." Charlotte walked back to the house with her hands pressed flat against her skirts and her heart going hard and fast in her chest. Pierce was controlling the narrative inside the manor. Of course he was. He had been doing it from the beginning. He had probably been doing it from the very first days of the Hawthorne-Bennett conflict, feeding information to both sides, making sure the wound stayed open. She needed to move faster. The second piece of evidence came from an entirely unexpected direction. Her Boston contacts had responded, both of them within the same week, with contract quotes that were, as she had predicted, significantly better than the Harwich renewal. She had brought the letters to Nathaniel's study in the ordinary course of estate business, and he had read them in the near silence that characterized most of their interactions, and then he had looked up and said, "How did you know to contact these particular firms?" "My father dealt with both of them," she said. "He trusted their accounting." Nathaniel held her gaze for a moment, and she watched him make the decision she always saw him make when she mentioned her father, the decision to be angry at the name before he processed the content. He looked back at the letters. "I'll review the terms," he said. "Of course." She was turning to leave when she added casually, as if it were a small thing, "I noticed the original Harwich contract is co-signed by Mr. Pierce. I wasn't sure if that arrangement had personal significance I should know about." She watched his back go still. "It doesn't," he said. "I didn't think so, but I wanted to ask." She left him with the letters and went directly to the attic. She had been going back through the old correspondence systematically, 2 hours at a time, always with a plausible reason nearby in case she was found. And on this particular afternoon, she found something that stopped her breath entirely. Tucked inside a packet of Edmund Hawthorne's personal letters, mixed in with condolence notes and land survey reports from 1802, was a single folded page in Edmund's handwriting. Not a formal letter. More like a memorandum, the kind a man writes to himself when he needs to think something through. It was undated, but the references in it placed it in the autumn of 1807, shortly before Edmund's death. "I have been examining the transfer documents again," Edmund had written. "I am no longer convinced that Richard Bennett authorized the final disbursements. The signature carries a particular forward slant that I have not seen in any of Richard's other authenticated correspondence. I have checked it against 6 separate samples. I do not know who to bring this concern to, as the only person I trust with the legal documents is Pierce, and Pierce was the one who first confirmed the signature's authenticity. If Pierce was wrong, it is a profound error. If Pierce was right and I am wrong, then I have done a man a grave injustice. If Pierce was not wrong, if Pierce was something else entirely, then I understand now why my father told me to trust no one completely." The memorandum ended there. Edmund had either been interrupted or had stopped himself from writing what he feared to commit to paper. Charlotte held the page in both hands and thought very clearly. He knew. He almost knew. And he died before he could act on it. She pressed her lips together hard. Then she heard footsteps on the attic stairs. She folded the memorandum and had it inside her dress before the door opened. It was not Pierce. It was Nathaniel, which was its own kind of alarm because he had never once come to the attic since she arrived. He stood in the doorway. He looked at her. He looked at the box she'd been going through, and at the papers she'd made a great show of sorting into a loose stack beside her, covering the ones she was actually reading. "What are you looking for?" he said. No preamble, direct. "Old household accounts," she said. "I'm trying to understand the estate's pre-1808 cost structure so I can compare it with current spending patterns." "Why?" "Because I think there may be efficiencies we're missing." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her with that flat measuring attention. "You could simply ask me," he said. "I could?" She agreed pleasantly. "But you tend to interpret questions as accusations, and I find working from primary sources avoids that particular difficulty." A very short silence. "What did you just say to me?" he said. She met his eyes. "I said that I find primary sources useful. It's a habit from watching my father run his business. He always wanted to understand the numbers himself before he spoke to advisors about them." She let that sit for exactly 1 second before adding, "He said it was the only way to know whether the advice you were getting was good or convenient." Nathaniel stared at her. Something was happening in his face, something she could not yet read, but it was not the blunt dismissal she'd come to expect. It was something more unsettled than that. "I'll be another hour," she said pleasantly. "I'll be out of your way after that." He stood in the doorway for a moment more. Then he turned and left without a word. Charlotte waited until his footsteps had completely faded before she took the memorandum out and read it one more time. If Pierce was something else entirely. Edmund Hawthorne had been 2 months from the truth when he died. Charlotte was going to finish what he started. She needed help, and she was careful about who she asked. The person she chose was Martha, which was the obvious choice, and also the one she'd been building toward since the first morning. Martha pressed a plate into her hands and told her not to let them see it. She told Martha everything on a Thursday evening in August, sitting in the kitchen after the rest of the household staff had retired. She laid out the letters, the memorandum, the Pierce correspondence she'd found in the misfiled packet, the account numbers she hadn't yet traced. She was precise and she was thorough, and when she finished, she folded her hands on the table and waited. Martha said nothing for a full minute. Then, "Jonathan Pierce has been advising this family for 31 years. I know. He handled every legal document after Edmund died. Every land deed, every contract renegotiation, every account transfer. Yes. Which means if he's been stealing, then we don't yet know how much," Charlotte said quietly. "Or from how far back. Or what he intends to do with it eventually." Martha's jaw set. Nathaniel trusts him. Nathaniel trusts him completely. Then if you go to Nathaniel with what you have now, Pierce will hear about it before nightfall and everything will disappear, Charlotte said. "I know. That's why I need to trace the account numbers without Pierce being in the room, and I need to do it through a legal source that Pierce does not have influence over." Martha was quiet again. Then, "My nephew works in the county land registry office. He's been there 11 years. He has no connection to Pierce that I know of." Charlotte looked at her steadily. "He's discreet," Martha said. "And he owes me 3 separate favors." She paused. "I'll contact him tomorrow." "Martha." Charlotte put her hand briefly on the older woman's. "If Pierce ever suspects you, he's been walking through this house like he owns it for 30 years, Martha said flatly. "He doesn't. It's time somebody reminded him of that." She stood, gathered the cups, and moved toward the sink with the absolute decision of a woman who has made up her mind and intends to act accordingly. "Go to bed, Mrs. Hawthorne. I'll have word from my nephew by the end of the week." 4 days later, Nathaniel said something to her that she had not expected. It was evening, and she was reading in the sitting room where the desk had been returned to its proper position, quietly, without explanation, sometime in mid-July when he appeared in the doorway. He did not knock. He stood there, in the particular way he had when something was sitting uncomfortably on him, and he was deciding whether to put it down. "Cooper's boy," he said. She looked up. "He was in the lower field yesterday when the ox team got loose. He was directly in the path." He paused. "I was 50 yards away. By the time I started moving, you'd already gotten him clear." Charlotte thought of it, the shout, the turning the boy frozen with his mouth open, and the simple fact of being closer and moving faster than anyone else. She had not thought about it as anything other than what it was. You saw a child in danger. You moved. "He wasn't hurt," she said. "I know." Another pause. "I saw it." She waited. "That's all," he said, and turned to leave. "Mr. Hawthorne." He stopped. She considered very carefully what she was about to say. "Your father wrote in a private memorandum I found in the attic that he had begun to doubt whether my father actually signed the final transfer authorizations." She kept her voice even. "He wrote that he intended to investigate further. He died the following winter without having done so." She paused. "I believe the investigation he never finished is the one I'm trying to complete now. And I believe the reason he never finished it is the same reason I have to be very careful about who knows I'm conducting it." The silence stretched. "You're saying someone stopped him," Nathaniel said. Very quiet. "I'm saying someone benefited from the investigation not happening," Charlotte said. "And that same someone has had 31 years of access to this estate's legal and financial records." She watched it land. Watched the thing in his face that moved when he was thinking hard about something. The slight tension at the corner of his jaw, the way his eyes went somewhere internal before they came back to her. "I need more time," she said. "That's all I'm asking. 2 more weeks. Don't speak to Pierce about any of this and give me 2 more weeks." A long pause. The longest one he had ever given her. "2 weeks," he said, and walked away. She let out a breath that she had been holding for much longer than 2 weeks. Outside, the summer had not broken. The fields were still gold, the nights still warm, the air still thick with the particular weight of August in Massachusetts. Charlotte sat in the lamplight with her father's letters in her lap and thought about how much ground she had covered and how much still lay ahead. She did not think about Nathaniel, not directly, but she was aware of the way the silence between them had changed. It was still silence. He was still cold, still walled, still a man organized entirely around an injury she had not caused. But something had shifted in the quality of it. The silence was no longer dismissal. It had become something more like waiting. She could work with waiting. She had been working with far less. The week before Martha's nephew was due to send his findings from the land registry, Jonathan Pierce returned to the manor. He arrived on a Monday morning with papers for Nathaniel to sign a routine contract renewal, he said, for the grain exchange that serviced 3 of the estate's tenant properties. Charlotte happened to be in the front hall when he arrived. She greeted him pleasantly. He greeted her with equal pleasantness. They were, to any observer, a perfectly cordial pair. But his eyes dropped to the stack of documents she was carrying. The estate accounts she was working through, and beneath them visible only if you knew what you were looking for. One edge of the shipping ledger she had been cross-referencing against the letter she'd found. His gaze returned to her face without pausing. He did not slow his stride, but Charlotte saw it. That half-second of recognition. The assessment. The recalculation. He had seen the ledger. He knew she had been in the shipping records. She watched him walk toward the study, and she thought, with very calm clarity, "I have less time than I thought." She turned and walked directly to the kitchen, where she asked Ruth to carry a message to Martha without telling anyone what it contained. The message was 4 words. Move the timeline up. By nightfall, Martha had sent a rider to the county land registry office. By the following morning, Charlotte had moved every piece of documentation she had gathered into a new hiding place that Pierce had no means of finding, even if he tore the sitting room apart. And by the morning after that, she was in the stable yard, watching Pierce ride out after his meeting with Nathaniel, and she was making herself remember something her father had said to her once, years before any of this began. "The most dangerous people, Charlotte, are not the ones who threaten you openly. They are the ones who smile while they close the door. She watched Pierce's horse reach the end of the drive and turn toward town. Then she went back inside to finish what she had started. Martha's nephew sent his findings on a Wednesday tucked inside an ordinary supply delivery from town, so that no one watching the Manor's correspondence would have reason to notice it. Charlotte opened the packet in the kitchen with Martha standing at her shoulder, and what she found inside made her set the papers down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something fragile when your hands have started to shake. The county land registry records told a story that Pierce had spent 20 years burying. Between 1803 and 1808, a series of land parcels, 7 in total. 3 of them formerly Hawthorne property, seized during the debt collapse. 4 of them, Bennett Holdings liquidated during the same period, had been transferred through a chain of holding entities so layered and deliberately obscured that Martha's nephew had needed 4 days and 3 separate ledgers to trace them. At the end of that chain, every single parcel had come to rest under the ownership of a land trust registered in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The trust had no public name, but it had a registered legal agent, Jonathan Pierce. Charlotte pressed her hand flat on the table and breathed. "He took the land," Martha said. Her voice was completely flat. "He manufactured the collapse of both families so that the land would be liquidated," Charlotte said. "Then he bought it through a shell trust at pennies to its actual value, while he was simultaneously advising both families on how to handle their losses." She picked the papers up again. "He's been sitting in this house for 20 years, managing Nathaniel's recovery, and the whole time he's been holding land that should belong to this estate." "How much is it worth now?" Charlotte looked at the parcel descriptions. "At current market value." She did the arithmetic quickly in her head, the way her father had trained her to. The 3 Hawthorne parcels alone conservatively $40,000. Martha was silent for a moment that felt very long. "Nathaniel needs to know," she said. "Nathaniel needs to know everything," Charlotte agreed. "But if I go to him this morning and Pierce hears about it before nightfall, which he will because he has someone inside this house, I'm almost certain of it, then Pierce has time to move the trust, dissolve the holding entities, and destroy whatever documentation still exists in his own offices." She set the papers down again. "I need the original transfer documents, the ones with the forged signatures. Without those, the land registry records prove he holds the parcels, but they don't prove how he got them." "Where would those documents be?" "His office in town." Charlotte looked at her steadily. "I need to get into that office." Martha stared at her. "That's not—" "I know what it is," Charlotte said quietly. "I know exactly what it is. But if those documents still exist, they are the only thing that ties the forged signatures to the land transfers in a way that a county court will accept." She kept her voice level. "Without them, Pierce walks free with $40,000 in stolen land and 2 destroyed families as his legacy, and there is nothing anyone can do about it." Martha was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My nephew owes me 3 favors. I've used 1. I know. I'll send him a second letter today." Charlotte looked at her with something she couldn't entirely keep out of her expression. "Martha, go eat breakfast," Martha said crisply, moving toward the stove. "You don't eat enough. You never eat enough. Go." Charlotte was halfway through the morning accounts when Nathaniel came to find her. He came in without knocking, which was not unusual, but he stopped just inside the doorway in a way that was different from his ordinary entrances, less purposeful, more like a man who has come somewhere and is now reconsidering whether he should have. "The 2 weeks are up," he said. She looked at him directly. "I know. Do you have what you need?" "Almost." She held his gaze. "I need 3 more days." His jaw tightened. "You said 2 weeks." "I know what I said." She kept her voice steady. 3 more days, Mr. Hawthorne. I have the land registry documentation. I have your father's memorandum and the Pierce correspondence. What I don't yet have are the original transfer documents with the forged signatures, and without those, everything else is circumstantial." She paused. 3 days. He stood there with his arms crossed, looking at her, and she could see the thing that was always at war in him, the part that had decided she was an enemy, squared off against the part that had been watching her for 2 months, and could not reconcile what it saw with what it had decided. "What made you start looking?" he said abruptly. "Before you even arrived? What made you believe your father was telling the truth?" It was the first personal question he had ever asked her. She felt the weight of it. "Because I knew my father," she said. "I knew the way he kept his accounts, and the way he shook hands, and the way he looked when he was telling the truth versus when he was managing something difficult. And when he told me that someone had done this to both our families deliberately, he looked the way he looked when he was telling me something true that hurt him." She held Nathaniel's gaze. He wasn't protecting himself. He was dying. He had nothing left to protect. All he had left was the chance to set the record right. The silence went long. 3 days, Nathaniel said, and left. The information from Martha's nephew arrived the following afternoon, and it was not what Charlotte had hoped for. Pierce's office did contain the original transfer documents. Her source had confirmed they existed, had seen a locked filing cabinet that matched the description she'd provided. But Pierce had increased the security around his offices in the past week. A second clerk, new locks, and a pattern of irregular visits at times that made unobserved entry effectively impossible. Someone had warned him. Charlotte sat with that for a moment, very still, working through what it meant. It meant that whoever was feeding Pierce information inside the manor had sent word after her conversation with Nathaniel, which meant it had happened within the last 3 days, which meant the source was someone with access to either the main hall or the private corridors. She thought through every person she had spoken to, every person who might have been within hearing range of the study doorway, every person who ran errands that took them into town. And then she thought about the supply boy 17 Quiet, who made the daily run between the manor and town, and who had, now that she examined it, always seemed to arrive back from his errands slightly later than the distance required. She didn't confront him. She sent him on a deliberately early errand the next morning and had Martha check his room in his absence. Under his mattress, they found 3 coins, new silver, the kind of payment that wasn't wages. Martha looked at the coins for a long moment. "I'll handle this," she said. "Don't frighten him," Charlotte said. "He's been selling information about this household to a man who destroyed this family," Martha said in a tone that brooked no argument. "He'll be frightened." The boy's name was Henry. He was 17 and had a mother in town, and had been approached by Pierce's clerk 4 months ago with an arrangement that had seemed simple at the time. A few words about what happened inside the manor, in exchange for enough silver to help his family through the winter. He sat in the kitchen chair and shook while Martha told him what Pierce had actually done to the Hawthorne estate, and by the end of it, his face had gone the color of old ash. Charlotte crouched down to his eye level, which she knew was not what he expected from the mistress of the house. "Henry," she said quietly, "I'm not going to turn you out, but I need you to do something. I need you to send exactly one more message to Pierce's clerk. One message with information I give you, and then it stops." He looked at her with the eyes of someone deciding whether to trust an unfamiliar hand. "What's the message?" he said. "That I've stopped investigating," she said. "That I gave up. That I told Mr. Hawthorne the whole thing was a misunderstanding, and I've put the documents away." Henry swallowed. "And after that?" "After that, you go back to your regular work, and you tell me if Pierce's clerk contacts you again." She held his gaze steadily. "Can you do that?" A moment's pause. "Yes, ma'am." She stood. "Thank you, Henry." She gave Pierce exactly what he wanted to hear. She gave him 3 days of false security, and she used every one of those 3 days to build what she actually needed. Missile. The plan that took shape was not elegant. It was practical, which Charlotte had long since decided was better than elegant anyway. Martha's nephew, whose name was Daniel, she had learned, and who had revealed himself over the course of this investigation, to be possessed of both considerable courage and a strong personal antipathy toward Jonathan Pierce, stemming from a land dispute 7 years prior, had a colleague in the Portsmouth Legal Registrar's office who had his own set of questions about the Shell Trust, questions he had been unable to pursue officially because Pierce had friends in official places. Daniel arranged a meeting. Charlotte wrote the letter that accompanied the documentation she sent, specific, precise, legally framed her father's training, evident in every line, and within 48 hours, she had a correspondence chain that tied Pierce's Portsmouth Land Trust to 3 separate accounts, at a Boston bank accounts that could be subpoenaed by county officials once a formal complaint was entered. She also had, through a contact of Daniel's in Pierce's own building, confirmation that the original transfer documents were housed in a specific locked cabinet and that the cabinet's key was kept on Pierce's person. Not in a drawer, not on a hook, on his body. Which meant the only way to get the original documents was to get Pierce somewhere he could be legally compelled to produce them. And the only person with the authority to compel that was a county magistrate. Charlotte wrote the third and final letter on a Sunday morning before the household was fully awake. It was addressed to Magistrate Harold Croft of Essex County, whom she knew by reputation as a man of stubborn integrity who had twice ruled against Pierce's clients in land disputes, and who was, according to Daniel, entirely immune to Pierce's social influence. She laid out the entire case. Every document, every traced account number, every forged signature, the Portsmouth Trust, the bank accounts, her father's letter, Edmund Hawthorne's memorandum. She wrote it the way her father had taught her to write, without emotion, without supplication, with the clean precision of someone who had the facts and trusted them to do their own persuading. At the bottom she wrote, "I am prepared to appear before any formal proceeding the court requires. I ask only that the matter be initiated before the subject is given opportunity to act on intelligence he may already possess." She sealed it and gave it to Daniel herself, riding out to meet him at the edge of the north field in the early morning, before anyone in the house was awake to ask where she was going. She was back at the manor table for breakfast, as if she had never left. Nathaniel looked at her across the table. She looked back. "The 3 days are up," he said. "I know." She folded her napkin. "I've sent the documentation to Magistrate Croft. I expect to hear from his office within the week." A pause. "You went around Pierce's access to me." "I went around Pierce's access to everything," she said. "I had to. He has a source inside this house. He's known for weeks that I was investigating." She held his gaze. "The supply boy has been sending him information. I found it last week. I used it to feed Pierce false intelligence long enough to complete the documentation." She paused. The boy didn't understand what Pierce was. He does now. Nathaniel was very still. The kind of stillness that happened when a man was reassessing something fundamental and the process was not comfortable. "How long have you known about the source?" he said. 4 days. "And you didn't tell me." "I needed to control what Pierce heard," she said. "If I told you and your response changed anything observable, Pierce would know the channel was compromised. I couldn't risk it." She kept her voice even. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I made the decision I believed was necessary, and I stand by it, but I understand why you'd find it." "Don't apologize," he said. His voice was strange, rough in a way she hadn't heard before. "Just don't." She stopped. He pushed back from the table and stood. He walked to the window, which he rarely did, and stood there with his back to her, and she watched his shoulders and tried to read something in the set of them. "My father," he said finally. He suspected. In the end, he suspected Pierce. "Yes. And he never said anything to me." "He died 6 weeks after writing the memorandum," Charlotte said gently. "I don't think he had time." A long pause. "I spent 7 years hating your father," Nathaniel said, still to the window. 7 years. I built this estate back up, and every stone I laid in his name as an insult, as proof that what he'd done to my family couldn't stop us." His voice had gone quieter. "And the whole time it was Pierce, in this house, at this table, eating my food and advising my accounts and standing at my father's funeral, and—" He stopped. Charlotte said nothing. There was nothing she could say that would be more useful than silence right now, and she knew it. "The magistrate," he said after a moment. "Croft. He's reliable." "By all accounts, yes." "Then we wait." "Yes." He turned from the window. He looked at her. really looked at her with the particular quality of attention that had been building for weeks, the kind that was not assessment anymore, but something that had moved past it into territory neither of them had named. "Charlotte," he said. And then he stopped, as if the name had surprised him on his own tongue. It was the first time he had used it. She felt it move through her like the first current of cold in a warm river, unmistakable and not entirely comfortable, because it mattered, and things that matter are always a little frightening. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once carefully. "Let's wait for the magistrate," she said. They did not have to wait as long as she'd expected, and not because things went smoothly. They did not go smoothly at all. Magistrate Croft sent his deputy to the manor on a Thursday 4 days after Charlotte's letter, with a summons for Pierce to appear before the county court the following Monday to answer questions regarding the land trust and the 1803 transfer documents. Pierce received the summons on Thursday evening. By Thursday night, 3 armed men were moving through the dark on the road toward Hawthorne Manor. Charlotte did not know this because she had anticipated it. She knew it because she couldn't sleep. She had been lying in her room for 2 hours when something pulled at her, a sound that was too deliberate to be an animal, or the particular silence that follows a sound being quickly suppressed. She was at her door before she had consciously decided to move. The hallway was dark. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet at 2 in the morning, that specific quality of stillness that is mostly occupied, breathing, and old wood settling. She stood in the doorway and listened, and in the listening she heard from the direction of the east entrance, the servant's door that opened onto the stable yard, the soft but unmistakable sound of a latch being tried. Not rattled. Tried. Patient and careful, the way someone tries a latch when they want to know if it's locked without making enough noise to wake anyone. She did not call out. She moved. She went for Nathaniel's room first because it was closest, and because she was not going to be anything other than completely practical in this moment. She knocked twice and opened the door without waiting, and said in a voice pitched low enough not to carry, "There are men at the east entrance. Get your rifle." He was out of bed before she finished speaking. 10 seconds and he was dressed enough and armed. "How many?" he said. "I heard one. I don't know. Go to the back of the house. Wake." "I'm not going to the back of the house," she said. He looked at her for a half-second. There was no time to argue, and they both knew it. "Stay behind me," he said, and moved. He went for the east entrance, and Charlotte went for the main study, because the east entrance was not the only way into the manor, and she understood with a cold and running clarity that Pierce would know the layout of this house as well as anyone in it. The study window was the second point of entry. She knew this because she had walked every room of this house, every corridor and exterior wall and window latch the way her father had taught her to walk any property she expected to be responsible for. You understand a place by understanding its weaknesses. Her father had said that. She had never imagined she would need it for this. She was inside the study when the window moved. It moved inward slowly. The way windows move when someone is pressing the latch from outside with a tool, rather than a hand, careful, controlled, silent. The kind of entry that professionals managed and amateurs didn't know enough to attempt. Charlotte stepped behind the door. She picked up the heavy brass bookend from the shelf beside her. And she waited. The window came fully open. A man came through it, large, moving with the particular economy of someone trained for this, and Charlotte hit him across the back of the skull with everything she had. He dropped. The sound it made was terrible, and she did not stop to examine it. She was through the study door and into the corridor, when the second man came from the east wing, running now, because whatever quiet they'd planned on was gone, and she was directly between him and the main staircase, where Nathaniel's voice was already carrying from the far end of the hall. The man grabbed her. He was twice her size, and he moved fast, and she felt his arm go around her before she could clear the doorway. And then she felt the blade, not deeply, not immediately, just a line of cold along her left side that she understood without looking at it. She drove her elbow back into his ribs as hard as she could. He grunted. His grip loosened by a fraction, and she twisted, and the blade moved with her, and she felt it go from a line of cold to something else entirely, something hot and immediate that she was not going to pay attention to. Right now, she was not going to pay attention to it right now. She got clear of him. Nathaniel came from the east corridor at a dead run, and the confrontation that followed was brief and extremely physical, and ended with the second man on the floor, and Nathaniel standing over him with a rifle and an expression that Charlotte had never seen on his face before. Something beyond anger. Something with edges on it that made the man on the floor go very still, very quickly. "Are you all right?" Nathaniel said without looking away from the man. "Yes," Charlotte said. He looked at her then. And she understood immediately that her answer had been wrong, because she saw it in his face before she felt it, the way his expression shifted from controlled fury to something sudden and raw, the way his eyes dropped to her side. She looked down. Her dress was dark at the left side, dark enough. "It's not serious," she said, and meant it because she genuinely did not know yet that it was. "Charlotte, secure that man first," she said, because her voice was still working and her legs were still working, and those were the two things she needed right now. "There's a third, I think. He was at the east entrance. Make sure he's been dealt with." Nathaniel looked at her with an expression she could not fully parse, something fractured in it, that she had never seen before on his face. Not in 7 months of this marriage. Not in any of the cold silences, or the dismissals, or the moments where his hatred had been so complete. It had taken up all the air in the room. This was something else. This was the face of a man who was afraid. "I'm going to shout for Briggs," he said, very controlled. "And then we are going to deal with your side. And the third man." "And the third man," he said. "Briggs first." The third man, it turned out, had lost his nerve when he heard the commotion and had not gotten past the stable yard. He was found by Tom Greer, who had been woken by his dogs, and who arrived with a shotgun and the absolute composure of a man who had dealt with worse. Charlotte let Martha clean and bind the wound, which was deep enough to matter, and which Martha dealt with in tight-lipped silence that conveyed everything she was feeling without expressing a word of it. The blade had cut along the lower left ribs. It would not kill her, but infection was the thing that killed people in situations like this, and they both knew it, and neither of them said it aloud. Nathaniel stood in the doorway of her room the entire time. He did not speak. He did not leave. He stood with his shoulder against the doorframe and his arms at his sides, and he watched, and the look on his face was something Charlotte could not afford to examine too closely right now because she had other things to manage. "The men Pierce hired will talk," Charlotte said when Martha had finished. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "The moment Magistrate Croft's office knows about tonight, Pierce loses whatever ability he has to maneuver. We need to send word before morning." "I'll send a rider," Nathaniel said. Still from the doorway. His voice was strange. "Tonight. Good." She shifted carefully, feeling the binding. "And Pierce, he'll know the attempt failed. He'll try to move first to get to the magistrate before we do." "He won't get there," Nathaniel said. Something in his voice had gone very hard. "Nathaniel." She used his name without thinking about it. It came naturally, the way things come naturally when the distance you've been maintaining suddenly feels like the wrong distance. "You have to let the magistrate handle this. You cannot—" "I know what I can and cannot do," he said. "Then act accordingly." She held his gaze. "Let the law do this. Everything we've built, every piece of documentation, every traced account, every letter, it means nothing if you ride out tonight in anger and give Pierce something to use against you." A long pause. She could see him working through it, feeling the resistance of his own nature against the logic she was pressing into it. "3 of his men came into my house," he said. "I know. One of them put a blade in you." "I know that too." "And you want me to wait for the magistrate?" "I want you to win," she said. "And winning means the magistrate not tonight." She paused. "Your father wanted to win too. He ran out of time. Don't waste what his caution couldn't protect." The silence that followed was long enough that she thought she might have pushed too far. Then Nathaniel exhaled once sharp and controlled and said, "I'll send the rider." He turned from the doorway. She heard him move down the corridor, heard him call for the stable hand on night duty. Heard the low, urgent exchange of instructions, and then the sound of hooves in the stable yard getting louder, and then fading as the rider took the road to town. Charlotte sat on the edge of her bed, her hand pressed carefully against the binding at her ribs, and she thought about what had happened tonight with the careful, methodical focus that she had discovered was the only way she knew to handle things that frightened her. Pierce had sent men to kill Nathaniel. She understood this clearly. The attempt was on Nathaniel, not on her. She had simply been in the way, which was a sentence that covered more ground than it appeared to. She had been in the way, and she had gotten cut for it, and she had not yet told Nathaniel that she had been between those men and him deliberately, that when she understood what was happening, she had put herself in the position most likely to stop it before it reached him. She was not going to tell him that. Not tonight. Tonight he needed to be thinking clearly, and not about this, and she needed him thinking clearly more than she needed him to understand what she'd done. The infection, Martha had said quietly, would be the danger. They needed to watch it carefully. Charlotte had nodded and said she understood, and promised to say immediately if anything changed. She lay down on top of the covers, fully dressed, and pressed her hand against her ribs, and did something she had not done in a very long time. She let herself feel how much it hurt. Not just the wound, all of it. 7 months of careful composure, of distance managed, and feeling sorted, and pain filed away in the organized interior she maintained, because she could not afford to do otherwise. The harvest celebration, and Nathaniel walking past her. Her father's letters, and the weight of carrying his last wish alone for months. The particular loneliness of being in a house where the person whose respect she most needed had decided before she arrived that she was not worth having. She pressed her hand against the binding and breathed slowly and let herself feel it for exactly 10 minutes. She counted them. Her father had taught her that too, that grief needed a container, and the container needed a limit, because the world would not stop requiring things of her simply because she was sad. After 10 minutes, she put it away. She would feel all of it again someday, when it was over, when she had the time. The rider was on the road to Magistrate Croft's house. The documentation was secured. The evidence was complete. Pierce had shown his hand tonight and burned whatever remained of his cover in the process. It was almost over. She did not hear Nathaniel come back to her doorway. She was not certain how long he stood there before she noticed. She turned her head and found him in the frame, his lamp low, his face carrying something she had not seen clearly enough to name yet, and was not certain she was prepared to. "The rider's away," he said. "Good." A pause. "Does it hurt?" he asked. She considered giving him the composed answer. Then she thought about 7 months, and the harvest celebration, and the stable yard in the summer dark, and she decided that they were perhaps past the composed answer. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He did not leave. "I'll sit in the hall," he said. In case you need anything in the night." She looked at him. He was not looking at her with any expression she could read simply, but it was not nothing. It was very specifically not nothing. "All right," she said. He went to the hallway. She heard the chair she kept outside her door scrape as he moved it close, and then she heard him settle into it, and then she heard the particular quality of silence that is not empty silence, but occupied silence, someone present nearby chosen. She turned her face back to the ceiling and thought with a clarity that felt almost painful. He's still too late. He's been wrong for 7 months, and one night of regret does not settle the account. But she also thought, he came back to the doorway. And she was honest enough with herself, lying in the dark with her ribs aching, and her father's letters pressed flat beneath the floorboard, and the summer heat still thick in the Massachusetts air, to admit that it mattered. More than she had been willing to let it matter before. The house settled around them. The night went on. Somewhere in the east, the first pale suggestion of morning was beginning to thin the dark. Jonathan Pierce did not know it yet, but he had run out of time. Nathaniel did not sleep. He sat in the hallway chair until the first gray light came through the corridor window, his rifle across his knees, his eyes fixed on Charlotte's door, and he sat with the particular stillness of a man whose interior landscape has been rearranged by force and who has not yet found the new shape of things. He kept returning to the same moment. The blade, her side, the dark spreading through the fabric of her dress, while she stood there, telling him to secure the third man first, her voice completely level, her eyes completely clear, as if the most urgent matter in that hallway was not that she was bleeding, but that the work still needed doing. He had spent 7 months in this house convinced he understood Charlotte Bennett. He had decided she was calculating. He had decided her kindness was performance, and her competence was maneuvering, and her patience was strategy. He had held every generous thing she did at arm's length and examined it for the angle, because the alternative was to admit that he had been wrong from the beginning, and Nathaniel Hawthorne had never been a man who found that easy. He sat in the hallway and listened to the house breathe around him and admitted it now. He had been wrong. Not partially wrong, not wrong, in ways that could be mitigated by the things he'd believed. Wrong from the foundation up in the way that requires you to go back to the beginning and rebuild everything. His father had almost known. Charlotte had finished what Edmund started at cost to herself, and she had not once asked for credit or comfort or even basic decency in return. She had asked only for time and the truth, and 3 days. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes and held it there. When Martha came down the hall at 6 in the morning and found him still in the chair, she stopped and looked at him with an expression that contained a great deal of information. "She's sleeping," Martha said. "I checked an hour ago. The wound is bound. She needs rest more than anything else right now." Martha set a cup of coffee on the floor beside the chair without being asked. "You should eat something." "I'm not hungry." That wasn't a question. She straightened. "There are 3 men in the cellar that need to be dealt with." "I know. And the magistrate's deputy will likely arrive before noon based on when you sent the rider." "I know that too." Martha looked at him for a moment, the long, steady look she had been giving him since he was 12 years old, and she had caught him lying about breaking a fence post, and had said nothing, simply looked at him until he told the truth himself. "She hid the injury last night," Martha said, "while you were securing the east entrance. She stood in that corridor and didn't say a word about the wound until you saw it yourself." Nathaniel said nothing. "She did that," Martha said, "because she didn't want you distracted from finishing the work." She paused. "That is not the behavior of a woman who came into this house to scheme against it." "I know," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Martha, I know." The housekeeper studied him for another moment. Then she picked up the empty cup from yesterday that had been left beside the chair and walked back toward the kitchen, and her silence on the way out was a different kind of silence than the one she'd carried, and less like judgment, more like the suspension of it. Nathaniel picked up the coffee she'd left. It was too hot, and he drank it anyway. Shun. The magistrate's deputy arrived at 10:30, a compact man named Sims, who carried himself with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned not to be impressed by large houses or the people who owned them. He spoke to Nathaniel in the study for 40 minutes, examined the documentation that Charlotte had assembled, laid out on the study desk, in precise order, with a written index in her handwriting, that made the deputy look up twice, and then asked to speak with the man who had intercepted the attackers the previous night. "My wife assembled the documentation," Nathaniel said. The phrase came out with unusual weight, as if he were saying it correctly for the first time. "She's the one you'll want to speak with. She's been conducting the investigation for the past 2 months. Sims looked at him. "Your wife?" "Yes." "The woman who was injured last night?" "The same." The deputy wrote something in his notebook. "Is she able to receive me?" "I'll ask her," Nathaniel said, and went upstairs. Charlotte was awake. She was sitting up in bed with her father's letters spread across the coverlet, her hair loose, the binding visible at her ribs, where her dressing gown had shifted, and she looked up when Nathaniel appeared in the doorway with an expression that was wary and composed in equal measure. "The deputy is here," Nathaniel said. "I know, I heard him arrive." She began gathering the letters into order. "I can come down." "You don't have to. I've been waiting 2 months for this conversation," she said. "I can walk down a flight of stairs." She looked at him directly. "Will you give me 10 minutes?" He nodded and went back downstairs and stood in the study, making conversation with Sims that he barely heard, because the thing happening in the upper part of his mind was louder than anything in the room. Charlotte came down in 12 minutes, dressed composed, the only concession to last night, a slight careful quality to the way she moved. She sat across from the deputy, and she laid out the case in the same way she'd apparently laid out the document, structured, precise, unhurried, with the instinctive economy of someone who understood that clarity was more persuasive than emphasis. Nathaniel sat in the corner of the room and watched her work and felt something happen in his chest that he had no immediate name for. It was not the sharp, specific thing of attraction, though that was present too quietly, and with more history behind it than he'd been willing to acknowledge. It was larger than that. Something more like recognition. The recognition of a quality you had encountered before, but not valued correctly, presented now in a context that made its worth undeniable. She had been trying to show him this for 7 months. He had refused to see it. "The original transfer documents," Sims said midway through. "You believe Pierce still holds them. I believe they are in the locked filing cabinet in his office," Charlotte said. "I have a witness who can confirm they were there as of 11 days ago. Since the summons was issued, Pierce will likely have attempted to move them. But the Portsmouth Trust documentation is substantial enough to constitute the foundation of the case even without them." She paused. "The bank accounts are the stronger chain. The land parcels are recorded. The trust is registered. The agent is Pierce. The money that funded the trust purchases matches to within reasonable accounting margin the amount that disappeared from both family estates in 1803. "That's a considerable claim," Sims said. "Yes," Charlotte agreed. "Which is why I spent 2 months documenting it before bringing it forward." The deputy wrote for another 3 minutes. Then he looked up. "Mrs. Hawthorne, last night's attack, you were directly involved in stopping 2 of the 3 men." "I was." "And the injury you sustained was incidental to the process," she said in a tone that clearly communicated this was not a direction she intended to develop. Sims looked at her for a moment with an expression that Nathaniel suspected very few people had seen on a county deputy's face, something approaching respect, offered plainly and without qualification. "We'll be moving to Pierce's offices this afternoon," he said. "I'd like to have a county constable here at the manor through the day as a precaution." "That would be appreciated," Charlotte said. After the deputy left, the study was quiet for a long moment. "Incidental to the process," Nathaniel said. Charlotte looked at him. "That's what you called it?" "That's what it was." "You took a blade in the ribs, Charlotte." "I'm aware of that." "And you told him it was incidental, because it was," she said, and something came into her voice that was the first genuinely unguarded thing he had heard from her. Not anger, not pain, but a bone-deep weariness with having to explain herself, with having to justify the choices she'd made as reasonable when they had always been reasonable. "I was in the way. I moved to stop something that needed stopping. I got cut. That is the full extent of what happened, and I am not going to dress it up as sacrifice or bravery or anything else, because it wasn't any of those things. It was just what the situation required, and I did it." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight in it. "Charlotte," he said, and then stopped, because he had gotten here to the beginning of the thing that needed to be said, and now that he was standing at it, he found himself without adequate language. She watched him with those direct, patient eyes that had been watching him from across the distance of this marriage since June. "I owe you," he started. "You don't owe me anything," she said. Her voice was not cold. It was honest, which was harder. "I didn't do any of this for you. I did it because my father asked me to, and because the truth deserved to be found, regardless of what you thought of me." She held his gaze. "I don't want your gratitude, Nathaniel. I don't want your guilt. I've had 7 months of your judgment, and I'd prefer not to simply exchange one form of it for another." He took that the way it landed, fully, without flinching. "Then what do you want?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "I want to know," she said quietly, "whether you're capable of starting over. Not forgiving, not forgetting. I'm not asking for any of that. Just whether there is a version of this marriage that begins somewhere other than the decision you made before you ever met me." The question sat in the room between them. Nathaniel thought about his father. About 7 years of reconstruction, driven by a hatred that had always been pointed in the wrong direction. About the harvest celebration and the look on Charlotte's face when he had walked past her, which he had not allowed himself to examine at the time, and was examining now with the particular discomfort of a man who had been cruel and knows it. "I don't know," he said, because it was true and she had earned the truth at minimum. "I don't know if I know how, but I would—" He stopped, tried again. "I would like to try." She looked at him for a long, considering moment. "All right," she said. Not forgiveness. Not warmth, not yet. But a door held open rather than closed, and Nathaniel understood with the dawning clarity of a man who has been wrong in a very large way for a very long time, that a held open door was more than he had any right to expect. Ned. The fever arrived that evening. Martha found it first. Charlotte had been quiet through supper, quieter than usual, and Martha had pressed a hand to her forehead in passing, with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone checking a known risk, and her face had gone still in the way faces go still when they find what they were afraid to find. "It's starting," she told Nathaniel in the hallway, her voice low and even. He was in Charlotte's room in 30 seconds. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her jaw set, her eyes bright with the particular brightness that was not quite alertness. She looked at him when he came in and said, "I'm fine," with the absolute conviction of someone who knew they were not fine, and was committed to the position anyway. "You are not fine," he said. "The fever is a precaution. Bodies do this. It doesn't mean—" "Charlotte." He sat down in the chair beside the bed, which he pulled close enough that they were nearly at eye level. "Stop." She closed her mouth. Something in his voice or in the directness of his sitting down had reached something that argument hadn't. "Tell me what you need," he said. She looked at him, that straight-on look, and he could see her deciding whether to give him the composed answer or the honest one. "Water," she said. "Cold cloth. And someone to check the binding in about an hour." "All right." He didn't move to get those things yet. "What else?" A pause. She looked away briefly, the first time he had ever seen her look away first. "I don't want to be alone with it," she said, very quietly. He nodded. "Then you won't be." He got the water and the cloth, and he sent for the doctor from town, who arrived at 9 o'clock, and examined the wound with grim thoroughness, and told Nathaniel in the hallway afterward that the blade had gone deep enough that infection was a real and serious risk, and that the next 48 hours would tell the story. Nathaniel went back into the room and sat down and did not leave. He was not by nature a man who sat still with helplessness. He had always moved through difficulty by working, by building and driving, and forcing outcomes through the application of sufficient effort. The 7 years of reconstruction had taught him that hard work could replace almost anything if you were willing to pay the cost. He had believed this so completely that he had structured his entire life around it, sitting beside Charlotte's bed while her fever climbed, and there was nothing to build, and no force to apply, and no outcome he could drive toward by working harder. This was a different kind of education. He read to her when she was awake enough to hear it. Her father's letters, which she had asked for specifically, and which he read in full for the first time as he read them aloud to her, and which hit him with a cumulative force that he had not anticipated and could not entirely manage. Richard Bennett had written to his daughter with the clarity of a man who knows he is running out of time. He had been specific about the evidence and what he suspected and where he thought it might be found. But threaded through the practical instructions was something else, a portrait of a father's knowledge of his daughter, detailed and particular in the way only long observation produces. "You will be patient when patience is the harder thing," he had written. "You will be kind when kindness costs you. You will not let them make you small. I know this about you as well as I know my own name." Nathaniel put the letters down at 11:30 and sat in the lamplight and felt the specific weight of having hated a man for 12 years, who had by every measure of evidence now available to him been entirely innocent. He pressed his hands together and bent his head. He was not a man who prayed easily. He had not prayed much since his father died because his father's death had made the practice feel hollow. But he sat in the chair beside Charlotte's bed, with the fever rising in her, and the lamp burning low, and he said in the interior silence, where prayer lives, something that was more honest than anything he'd managed to say aloud. I was wrong. I've been wrong since the beginning. If you let her live through this, I will spend the rest of my life making it right. It was not eloquent. He had not been eloquent in a very long time, but it was true in every syllable which he thought might count for something. The fever broke at 4 a.m. on the second day. Nathaniel was asleep in the chair when Martha shook his shoulder and he came awake fast, the way men who've done military service always do, and Martha said, "The fever's down. She's asking for water." He was at the bed before Martha finished the sentence. Charlotte's eyes were open. They were clear, not the bright artificial clarity of fever, but the ordinary real clarity of a person who has come back from somewhere difficult and arrived intact. She looked at him with an expression that was too tired for surprise, but contained somewhere underneath the exhaustion something that was not entirely composure. He poured the water and held the cup while she drank, and she let him, which told him more about how the 2 days had affected her than anything she'd said. "The magistrate," she said when she'd finished. "Sims went to Pierce's offices yesterday afternoon," Nathaniel said. "Pierce wasn't there. He'd left town the morning after the attack." He paused. They found the filing cabinet. The original transfer documents were still inside it. She closed her eyes for a moment. "He panicked," she said. "Yes, he left in enough of a hurry that he forgot the one thing he needed to take with him." Nathaniel watched her face. "Sims has the documents. The county sheriff has an arrest warrant. Pierce was apprehended in Portsmouth this morning at his trust agent's office." Charlotte opened her eyes. "It's done," she said. "It's not done," he said. "There'll be proceedings. It'll take time. But the warrant is issued, and Pierce is in custody, and the documentation is with the magistrate." He held her gaze. "It's done enough." She breathed out slowly, a long, releasing breath that carried 2 months of sustained tension with it. "My father," she said quietly. "I know." His voice was rough. "I know." They sat in the silence that followed, and Nathaniel understood that this was one of those moments that would not be improved by speaking, that some things needed to be felt without being narrated, and that he had used words badly enough in this marriage, that he owed her several of these silences at minimum. After a while, she said, "You stayed?" "Yes." "Both nights?" "Yes." She looked at him. "Why?" He thought about the true answer and the many less true answers he could give instead, and he gave her the true one. "Because I couldn't be anywhere else," he said. "Because the thought of being in the other room while you were, I couldn't do it. I tried the first night after I sent the rider, and I made it to the end of the corridor, and I couldn't." Something moved in her face. She did not say anything immediately. "Nathaniel," she said finally, "I need you to understand something." "All right. I don't regret anything I did. Not the investigation, not putting myself between those men and you, not any of it. I would do it again." She held his gaze steadily. "But I need you to understand that I did it for the right reasons. Not because I expected you to soften toward me. Not as a strategy. I did it because it was right, and because my father asked me to, and because I believe that the truth matters even when it's inconvenient and hard to find." "I know that," he said. "I need you to say it like you mean it." "I know that," he said again, and the second time was different from the first, slower and more complete. "I know you did it for the right reasons. I know you have been doing everything in this house for the right reasons since the day you arrived. And I know that I made every possible effort not to see it, and I know that was—" He stopped. "I was wrong. I have been wrong about all of it. I know that is insufficient." Her eyes were very bright. Not fever bright. Something else. It's a start, she said. He went back through her things while she slept. Not secretly, not searching, she had offered the morning of the third day to show him whatever he wanted to see, and he had taken her at her word. He sat with the documentation she'd compiled, the letters his father's memorandum, the land registry records, the Pierce correspondence, the indexed file that the deputy's assistant had called the most organized private investigation he had seen, presented to a county court. He read it all. He read his father's handwriting on the memorandum and felt it like a physical thing. The old man's cautious, careful mind working toward a truth he'd never reached, the signature of a man who had died believing himself possibly complicit in an injustice he hadn't been able to confirm. If Pierce was something else entirely. Edmund had been right. He had almost gotten there. Nathaniel set the memorandum down and pressed his hand flat on the desk, and sat with the weight of it, 12 years of misdirected grief, of a hatred built on a lie that Pierce had constructed and maintained, with the patience of a man who considered both families entirely expendable. His father had died in the middle of figuring it out. Charlotte had finished the work. He went back upstairs. She was awake, sitting up, more color in her face than he'd seen in 3 days. She was reading the household accounts because she was apparently constitutionally incapable of resting without doing something useful, and he found he could not be irritated by this, only quietly undone by it. "The Harwich contract," he said from the doorway. She looked up. "The Boston suppliers. You said the terms were better. 12% better conservatively," she said, watching him. "Possibly 15 once we negotiate volume. Then we'll use them." He paused. "And the Cooperage building, Tom Greer said you've been managing the repair schedule yourself." "It's almost done. Another week." "Good." He leaned against the door frame. "The Eastfield families, Cooper, Miles, Greer, they've been asking after you." Her expression shifted slightly. "They don't need to do that. They want to," he said. "They asked me yesterday if you were going to be all right. Greer in particular." He paused. He said, "I'm not going to reproduce his exact words because they were somewhat pointed at my expense. But the general meaning was that this estate has not had a mistress who gave a damn about the tenant families in a very long time, and that he would consider it a personal affront if anything happened to you." Something crossed her face. She looked back at the accounts and said nothing, but the set of her mouth had changed. "Charlotte." She looked up again. "I'm going to do this badly," he said. "I want to be honest about that up front. I've been organized around the wrong things for a long time, and habits of that kind don't go away because you've decided they should. I'm going to get things wrong. I'm going to be too hard sometimes and too slow to understand, and I will likely say things in the wrong order or with the wrong weight behind them." He held her gaze. "But I am not going to walk past you again. I am never going to do that again. Whatever else I get wrong, that one I won't." The silence was very complete. "You remember that," she said quietly. "I have thought about nothing else for 3 days." She looked at him with an expression that was carefully assembled, but not, he thought, impenetrable. Something was working behind it that she was deciding whether to let through. "Come sit down," she said. He pulled the chair close and sat, and she held the accounts out to him and said, "Look at the October grain storage costs. Tell me if you see what I see." And for the next 2 hours, they sat together in the late afternoon light and worked through the estate finances side by side, her finger on the columns, his voice when he had questions, and the space between them. Not the space of estrangement or distance, but something else entirely, the careful, tentative space of two people learning the shape of each other without the distortion of hatred between them. It was not reconciliation. Not yet. It was something earlier and more fragile, the first actual morning of something that had been called a marriage for 7 months without being one. Martha appeared in the doorway at 6 o'clock, looked at the two of them at the desk together, and left without a word. But she was smiling when she went. The letter from Magistrate Croft arrived on a Friday, 10 days after the arrest. Nathaniel brought it upstairs himself and handed it to Charlotte, who was dressed and moving carefully, but moving which the doctor had confirmed was the right direction. She broke the seal and read it, and then she read it again, and then she set it face down on the desk and was quiet for a moment. "What does it say?" Nathaniel asked. "Pierce has confessed," she said, "to the magistrate. All of it, the forged signatures, the shell trust, the land transfers, the arrangement with his Portsmouth agent." She paused. "He also confirmed in writing that my father had no knowledge of or involvement in any part of the scheme." The room was very still. "He did it to avoid a full trial," Charlotte continued. Her voice was level. "His counsel told him the documentation was airtight, and a trial would destroy whatever remained of his reputation in every county he'd ever worked in. A confession with a guilty plea gives him some small measure of control over the narrative." She paused. "He is 61 years old. He will be in prison until he is not." Nathaniel looked at her face. She was looking at the window. "Charlotte," he said. "My father's name is cleared," she said, "officially, by written confession. Every document that bore his forged signature is now voided." She stopped. "He won't know. He can't know. I can't." She stopped again. "He knew," Nathaniel said. "When he sent you here, he knew. He trusted you to finish it." He moved close enough to put his hand over hers on the desk. "He knew." She turned her hand under his so that their palms were together. She gripped once hard and then released. "The land," she said, collecting herself. "The 7 parcels. The magistrate says the trust is being dissolved and the properties will be returned to the original estates." 3 of them are Hawthorne land," Nathaniel said. "The other 4 were Bennett properties." She met his eyes. "They technically come to me as the last Bennett, which means they come to this marriage." He looked at her steadily. "They're yours," he said. "Not mine. Yours." She held his gaze for a moment. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement wordless of what it meant that he'd said it that way. "Ours," she said. Nathaniel felt something release in his chest that had been held there so long he'd forgotten it was a held thing. It went out of him quietly, without drama. 12 years of wrongly directed grief, of hatred, that had cost him more than Pierce's scheme ever had, of a wall built so high that the wrong person had been standing outside it this entire time. He exhaled. "Ours," he said, and meant it in every sense the word could carry for the first time in his life. The word spread the way words always spread in small Massachusetts counties, faster than any rider, quieter than any official announcement, moving from kitchen to stable yard to market stall to church step, until by the second week of September, every family within 20 miles of Hawthorne Manor knew 2 things simultaneously: that Jonathan Pierce had confessed in full to Magistrate Croft's court, and that Richard Bennett had been innocent all along. The reactions were not uniform, and Charlotte was honest enough with herself to have expected that. Some people, the Greers, the Coopers, the Miles family, the handful of county families who had watched Charlotte work through the summer and drawn their own conclusions, received the news with the particular satisfaction of people who had suspected as much and were glad to be confirmed. Others received it with the more complicated response of people who had repeated Pierce's version of events at dinner tables and in drawing rooms for years, and were now confronted with the arithmetic of their own participation in a lie. The third category was the one Charlotte watched most carefully. These were the people who had treated her with open contempt at the harvest celebration, who had shifted away when she approached, who had accepted Nathaniel's wordless dismissal of her as the correct social position and arranged themselves accordingly. These people now had a choice to make about how to conduct themselves going forward, and the choice they made would tell her a great deal about the county she was going to be living in for the rest of her life. She did not make it easy for them. She did not make it hard either. She simply continued doing what she had been doing, managing the estate accounts, sitting with tenant families, teaching Ruth her letters 3 mornings a week at the kitchen table. And she let the facts of her daily behavior constitute whatever case needed to be made, the same way she had done since June. Nathaniel watched all of this with the particular attention of a man who is learning to see something clearly for the first time and finds the education both necessary and uncomfortable. He had changed since the night of the attack in ways that were not theatrical, which Charlotte appreciated. She had seen enough of men's remorse to know that the dramatic kind, the sweeping gestures, the grand declarations made in the heat of shock, rarely survived contact with ordinary life. What she was watching in Nathaniel was something different and more durable. It was the slow, deliberate work of a man dismantling habits that had organized him for 12 years and building something different in their place. He ate at the table every evening now. Not silently, he talked carefully at first about the estate, about what needed doing about the land registry proceedings, and the schedule for recovering the 3 Hawthorne parcels from Pierce's dissolved trust. And then gradually about other things. About his father, which was the hardest, and which he approached the way a man approaches a wound he has kept bandaged for too long, with the understanding that air is necessary even when it hurts. He used to take me out to the north field in the evenings. Nathaniel said one night, his hands around his coffee cup, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone talking about something they haven't talked about in years. When I was young, before all of it, he'd walk the boundary lines and tell me the name of every family that had worked this land and what they'd built and what they'd left behind. He paused. He said the land remembered things that people forgot. That if you listened to it correctly, it told you what kind of man you were supposed to be. Charlotte kept her eyes on him across the table. What kind of man did it say? He looked at her. A better one than I've managed, he said. She did not offer him absolution. She didn't think that was what he was asking for. She thought what he was asking for was witness someone to hear the admission without dismissing it or inflating it into more than it was. You have time, she said. The land's not going anywhere. Something shifted in his face. No, he said. I reckon it isn't. The word reckon came out with a naturalness that made Martha, passing through the doorway with the breadbasket, glance between them with an expression she did not trouble to conceal. The formal court proceedings regarding the Pierce estate took 3 weeks, during which Charlotte appeared twice before Magistrate Croft to give testimony, both times with Nathaniel seated directly behind her, and the full documentation laid out in the order she had indexed it 2 months earlier in the sitting room of a house that had not yet decided whether to accept her. Croft was a thorough man. He asked detailed questions and accepted detailed answers, and he had Charlotte observe the valuable judicial quality of being genuinely interested in what the evidence said, rather than in confirming a position he had already arrived at. By the end of the second session, the case was as complete as it was going to be. Pierce, it emerged, had begun his scheme, not in 1803, but in 1798, when he had first identified the Hawthorne-Bennett joint venture as an opportunity. He had spent 5 years positioning himself as the trusted advisor to both families before executing the collapse. The forged signatures had been the mechanism. The shell trust had been the vehicle. His own impeccable reputation had been the cover. He had stolen not only the 7 land parcels, but a quantity of liquid assets that the Portsmouth bank records placed at somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000 over the full span of the scheme. When Croft read the total figure aloud in the courtroom, there was a silence that had a specific texture to it. Charlotte sat very still and thought about her father dying in a rented room in Boston, with his business collapsed around him, having spent the last year of his life being blamed for a crime committed against him. And she pressed her hands flat on the table in front of her and breathed through the specific grief of that until it passed enough to be managed. Nathaniel's hand came to rest on the table beside hers, not on top of it, beside it, close enough that their fingers nearly touched. Offering without demanding. She turned her hand so the backs of their fingers made contact. They sat that way through the remainder of the proceedings. The morning after the final ruling, Charlotte did something she had not done since she arrived at Hawthorne Manor. She went to find Nathaniel, not for a practical reason, not because there was a state business requiring attention, not because something needed managing, or a decision required his input. She went to find him simply because she wanted to speak to him, which was a distinction that felt significant enough to notice. He was in the north field, walking the boundary lines the way his father used to, and he turned when he heard her come through the gate and waited. She stopped when she reached him, and they stood together on the edge of the field in the early morning, the last warmth of the Massachusetts summer going golden around them, and she said, "I want to ask you something." "All right." "The night of the attack." She held his gaze. "Before you came to my doorway and said you'd sit in the hall, did you already know that I had gotten between those men and you deliberately?" He was quiet for a moment. "I suspected," he said. "When did you suspect?" "When you told me to secure the third man first." He looked at her directly. A woman who had accidentally been cut while trying to get clear of an attacker doesn't give orders about perimeter security. A woman who had put herself in a specific position for a specific reason does. He paused. "I didn't say anything because you clearly didn't want me to, and because I was trying to understand why. And now I understand why." His voice was quiet. "You did it because it was the right thing to do, and because the work wasn't finished, and because you are, Charlotte, entirely incapable of leaving something half done when you can see the whole shape of it." He held her gaze. "And possibly because you are braver than I have any right to have deserved in a wife." She looked at him. "I'm not brave," she said. "I'm practical. There's a difference." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." "All right." Something came into his expression that was not quite a smile, but was in that direction. "Then you are the most consequentially practical person I have ever encountered, and I have built a 12-year hatred on a lie. And you walked into this house knowing that and stayed anyway. And I would like to spend a considerable amount of time making sure you never have cause to regret it." He paused. "If that's acceptable." Charlotte looked at him across the golden morning, across 7 months of everything this marriage had been, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. "It's acceptable," she said. He reached out and took her hand. Not briefly, not perfunctorily. He took it the way a man takes something he intends to hold, and he held it, and they stood together in the north field while the morning came fully in around them. The event that the county would talk about for the next 20 years happened on a Saturday in late September, and it was not planned by either of them, or rather it was planned by Nathaniel, who had spent 2 weeks organizing it with the help of Martha and Tom Greer and Daniel from the Land Registry office, and a considerable quantity of stubbornness, and Charlotte only discovered what he had done when it was already done. He had called a gathering, not a private dinner, not a small affair for close neighbors, a full county gathering, the kind her father had described from the old days when Hawthorne Manor had been a place the whole community came to. He had sent invitations to every family within riding distance, to the county officials, to the merchants, to the women who had shifted away from Charlotte at the harvest celebration, and to the men who had looked through her. He had, in short, invited everyone who had witnessed the worst of it. Charlotte found out at breakfast on the Saturday morning itself, when Martha informed her that the kitchen had been working since 5 o'clock, and that there were approximately 200 guests expected by noon. She looked at Martha. Martha looked back with an expression that was entirely innocent and entirely unconvincing. "He should have told me," Charlotte said. "Yes, ma'am." Martha agreed. "I would have told him it was unnecessary." "Yes, ma'am," which is likely why he didn't tell you. Charlotte pressed her lips together and went to find her husband. She found him in the front hall, looking more genuinely nervous than she had ever seen him. Not the controlled tension of a man managing a crisis, but the specific nerves of someone who has done something that matters to him and is waiting to find out whether it will work. "You should have told me," she said. "I know," he said. "I would have told you not to do it." "I know that too." He looked at her steadily. "That's why I'm asking you to trust me on this one. You trusted me to let the magistrate handle Pierce. Let me handle this." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "You have exactly one chance to not make this worse." "That's all I need," he said. 200 people filled the grounds of Hawthorne Manor by early afternoon, and the gathering had the particular quality of events that have been organized around an unspoken purpose. Everyone aware that something was going to happen without being certain what the social temperature, running a degree or two warmer than ordinary people watching Nathaniel with sideways attention and watching Charlotte with something more complex. Charlotte moved through the gathering with the composure that had become over 7 months the thing she was most known for. She spoke to the Greer family, the Coopers, the Miles. She accepted the carefully worded acknowledgments of several women who had not spoken to her since June, with the gracious neutrality of someone who understood that people needed a way back that didn't require them to explicitly account for having been wrong. She was speaking with the wife of the county clerk, the woman whose name she had memorized on the night of the harvest celebration, and who was now looking at her with an expression that carried a great deal of retroactive apology in it when she heard Nathaniel's voice carry across the gathering from the front steps. He did not call for attention loudly. He simply stopped moving and stood, and the quality of his stillness was the kind that made people look the way it always had, because Nathaniel Hawthorne was a man whose stillness occupied space. The gathering settled. "I want to say something," he said. His voice was even, and it carried. "To all of you, because most of you were here in June, and what you saw then was not something I can pretend didn't happen." Very complete silence. "I married Charlotte Bennett believing I had cause to despise her family," he said. "I made no secret of that. I treated her accordingly in this house and in front of this community, and I did not trouble myself to investigate whether my reasons were sound." He paused. "They were not sound. They were a lie, constructed by a man who has since confessed in full to Magistrate Croft's court, and who used my grief and my father's death and the goodwill of 2 decent families as the material for his own enrichment." No one moved. "Richard Bennett was innocent," Nathaniel said. The words were simple, and he said them without elaboration, understanding that they did not need any. Every document that bore his name in that scheme was forged. Every accusation leveled at his family was manufactured. He died without vindication, and I will carry the knowledge of my role in that for the rest of my life. Charlotte stood very still at the edge of the gathering. She had not prepared herself for this. She had prepared herself for almost everything that had happened in the last 4 months, but not for this, for Nathaniel Hawthorne, standing on the steps of his own house and accounting for himself to 200 people without excuses or deflection. "My wife," he continued, and his voice shifted not louder but more direct, "came into this house knowing she would be hated. Knowing I had married her as an act of deliberate punishment. She came anyway, because her father asked her to find the truth, and because she believed the truth was worth finding, regardless of the cost to herself." He paused. The cost, as some of you know, was considerable. Someone in the gathering coughed. Someone else was very quiet in the way people are quiet when they are trying not to be seen being moved. "She is the reason Jonathan Pierce is in custody," Nathaniel said. "She is the reason the land stolen from both our families is being returned. She is the reason my father's suspicions, which he died before he could confirm, have now been confirmed by the full confession of the man who spent 30 years in this house, pretending to serve it." He looked out at the gathered faces. "And she did all of it while I was treating her in a manner that should have made her leave. And she did not leave, and she never once asked for credit or for my gratitude. And she has more of both than I will ever adequately express." He stepped down from the steps. The gathering parted for him as he moved, and he walked toward Charlotte with the directness of a man who knows where he is going and does not intend to stop. She watched him come and kept her face composed with the last of the composure she had available, which was not very much by this point. He stopped in front of her, in front of 200 people and every person in this county who had watched him walk past her in June. "I married you for the wrong reasons," he said. His voice was quiet now, meant for her, though in the stillness it carried anyway. "I treated you as a consequence of someone else's crime. I was wrong. I was wrong about your father. I was wrong about you. And I was wrong about what this marriage was supposed to be." He reached out and took both her hands. "I am not asking you to forgive all of it today. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I am only asking you to let me spend the rest of my life proving that I understand what I nearly destroyed." Charlotte looked at him. Her hands were steady in his. They had always been steady. She thought about June and the harvest celebration, and the desk moved into the hallway, and 2 nights in a chair beside her door. She thought about her father's letters, and Edmund's memorandum, and Pierce's face when he'd watched her from across the parlor, and calculated whether she was a threat. She thought about the Northfield in the morning, and hours said in the lamplight. She thought about the 10 minutes she had given herself in the dark to feel everything that hurt, and the promise she had made to feel it fully when it was over. It was over. "I don't need the rest of your life as proof," she said. Her voice was clear, and it carried the way his had. "I need you to be honest with me. To tell me when you're getting something wrong before it gets large enough to matter. To treat the people on this land the way they deserve to be treated." She held his gaze. "And I need you to never walk past me again." "I already promised you that," he said. "Then keep the promise," she said. "That's all." He lifted her hands and pressed them briefly to his mouth, and it was not a theatrical gesture. It was the gesture of a man in a private moment that happened to be taking place in front of a great many people, and that distinction was visible to everyone watching. The gathering was very quiet for a moment. Then Tom Greer started clapping because Tom Greer was 71 years old and entirely past caring what was appropriate, and within 10 seconds, half the grounds had followed. And Martha, standing at the corner of the manor house, with her hands clasped in front of her, was looking at the summer sky as if it required her full attention. The weeks that followed were not perfect. Charlotte had not expected them to be. There were mornings when Nathaniel's habits ran ahead of his intentions, and he shut a door before he thought to leave it open. There were evenings when the weight of 12 years, organized around a specific grief, came out sideways in a shortened word, or a too long silence, and Charlotte recognized it for what it was, and said so directly, and he heard her, which was the part that mattered. She had learned that the difference between a man who was trying and a man who was performing trying was audible in the response to being told when he was wrong. Nathaniel heard her when she corrected him. He didn't argue the correction, or redirect it, or minimize it. He heard it, considered it, and adjusted. This was not small. He went to the Northfield boundary most evenings now, and he told her the names of the families, the way his father had told him, and she listened and filed them with the same care she gave everything, because a name was not a small thing. It was the record of someone's presence on the land, and presence deserved to be remembered. She wrote to Daniel at the land registry, and to Martha's various contacts, and to 2 women in Boston who had been friends of her mother's, and she began the methodical process of restoring the Bennett family's standing in the official record. Not as charity, not as recompense, as accuracy. The record had been falsified. She was correcting it. The distinction was one her father would have appreciated. Ruth got through an entire chapter of the household primer on a Thursday morning and announced this to the kitchen at large in a voice that required no amplification. And Charlotte hugged her and got flour on her dress and did not care at all. And Nathaniel walked through the kitchen, in the middle of it, looked at the flour, looked at Charlotte's face, and said, without breaking his stride, "Carry on," in a tone that contained, if you were listening for it, something adjacent to warmth. Martha heard it. Her expression did not change, but her pace slowed for exactly 2 steps. The autumn celebration was Charlotte's idea. She proposed it to Nathaniel in October, 3 weeks after the Pierce proceedings concluded, laying it out with the same matter-of-fact directness she brought to estate business, the guest list. The practical arrangements, the purpose which she stated plainly, as a community gathering, to mark the end of something and the beginning of something else. "The county has been carrying the weight of what Pierce did for 20 years, she said. "Not just this family. The families he manipulated against each other, the neighbors who repeated his version of events and now have to figure out what to do with that. A gathering gives people somewhere to put it." She looked at Nathaniel. "And it gives us somewhere to put it, too." "When?" he said. "First week of November, before the winter closes the roads." He nodded. "I'll send the invitations." "I'll handle the accounts," she said. "I know you will," he said. which in the language they were developing meant several things at once. The night of the autumn celebration, Hawthorne Manor was lit from every window, the way it had not been since Edmund's time, and the county came not out of obligation, not out of the careful political calculation that had brought people to the harvest celebration in June, but because the story of the summer had moved through the community and left something in its wake that wanted acknowledging. They came because they had watched Charlotte Bennet manage a hostile household with quiet dignity. They came because they had heard about the night of the attack, and about the fever, and about Nathaniel Hawthorne sitting in a hallway chair until 4 a.m. They came because Tom Greer had been telling anyone who would listen that the Hawthorne estate had the best mistress it had ever had, and Tom Greer was not a man given to exaggeration. Charlotte stood at the entrance of the great hall and received them with Nathaniel beside her, not behind her, not at a separate point of the room, but beside her, his hand occasionally at the small of her back. When someone new approached a gesture so quiet and habitual that she was not certain he was fully aware he was doing it. She was aware of it. She noticed each time. The county clerk's wife sought her out deliberately, maneuvering through the crowd with the focused intent of a woman on a specific errand, and when she reached Charlotte, she said without preamble, "I was unkind in June. I'm sorry for it." Short and unadorned, which was the only way apology worked when it was real. "Thank you," Charlotte said, and meant it. Several other similar exchanges happened over the course of the evening, some graceful and some clumsy, and Charlotte received all of them with the equanimity she had earned through months of practice. She was not performing magnanimity. She was genuinely less interested in the accounting of who had treated her poorly than in the forward motion of the community they were all going to continue inhabiting together. Her father had said something once, she couldn't remember the exact occasion, that justice and vengeance were not the same thing, and that people who confused them usually ended up with neither. She had filed that away with the other things she carried from him, and she thought of it now moving through a room full of people who were in the process of deciding who they wanted to be on the other side of this story. She thought, he'd have liked to see this. The grief of that was clean now, the way grief goes clean when it's been felt properly. Still present, still real, but no longer the raw and uncontrolled thing it had been in the dark of her room in August. She carried it differently. She thought she always would. Nathaniel found her at the edge of the hall an hour into the evening, appearing at her elbow in the way he had developed of arriving near her without announcement, as if proximity had become a habit he was no longer monitoring. "Greer is telling the Cooper family about the water line repair," he said. His voice was very dry. "In considerable detail. He's describing your technique." Charlotte pressed her lips together. "I fixed the water line. It needed fixing. You rolled up your sleeves in front of 3 tenant families. I was in the way, and it needed doing, and I had the right grip for it." "Tom Greer," Nathaniel said, "is going to be telling this story at his grandchildren's weddings." "Then I hope they find it useful," she said. And he made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, real and brief, and low, the kind that escapes before a person decides to let it. And Charlotte felt it in her chest, like the first note of something that would eventually be a full piece of music. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the room moved around them with its noise and light. And she thought about June, about standing at this window with nowhere to look but the dark of the summer fields alone in a crowd in her own house. About the particular loneliness of that night, the press of it, the way she had counted her breaths to keep her face correct. She was not alone in this room tonight. She had not been alone in it for some time if she was being accurate about when things had actually shifted. It had not been the night of the attack, or the fever, or the magistrate's proceedings. It had been earlier and smaller. A memorandum read aloud in a lamp-lit room, a plate of biscuits pressed into her hands. A stable-yard conversation in the summer dark, where she had said, "I know what I'm working with," and discovered that she did not quite, but that she was going to find out. "The hall," Nathaniel said. She looked at him. He held out his hand. Not tentatively, with the same directness he gave everything once he had decided on a thing. "Dance with me." he said. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She thought about the harvest celebration and Mrs. Eleanor Marsh and the 200 people now watching from various points around this room, and she thought yes. "All right," she said. She took his hand, and he led her out to the center of the hall, and the gathering parted the way it had parted for him on the steps in September, naturally, because a room full of people can feel when something is real. He put his hand at her waist, and she put hers at his shoulder, and they moved together into the music with the particular quality of two people who have not danced together before, but have learned the shape of each other through other means. And it was not graceful in the way of long practice, but it was steady, and steady was better. "I once married you for revenge," he said quietly enough that only she could hear it. "And every day since then I have been learning how wrong I was to waste a single minute of it." She met his eyes directly. "Then stop wasting them," she said. He pulled her 1/fraction of an inch closer. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And the candles burned, and the music played, and the county of Essex bore witness to the thing that hatred for all its years and all its force had ultimately failed to prevent two people finding their way to each other through the wreckage of a lie, and choosing with full knowledge of everything it had cost to begin. Some wounds took 20 years to create. Some truths took a braver heart than most to find. And some loves the real ones, the ones built on honesty and hard-won respect. And the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself arrived not in spite of all the wrong that came before them, but because someone refused even at great personal cost to let the wrong be the final word. Charlotte Bennet had walked into a house built on hatred, and quietly, methodically, at cost to her comfort and her safety, and the carefully composed surface she maintained over everything she felt, she had rebuilt it into something worth living in. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, everything. And it was hers, completely, permanently, irrevocably hers in every sense that mattered.